Hello, everybody. We are at the end of July, July 31st, 2025. And the news, at least on first sight, doesn't seem very good for the Democratic Party. The Wall Street Journal, perhaps the greatest now defiant opposition to Donald Trump, reports that the Democrats have got the lowest ratings from voters in 35 years, a journal poll finds. The numbers are very bad. Not that the Republicans are particularly popular, but the Democrats are much less popular. The news, however, for the Democrats might not be quite as bad as the Wall Street Journal is reporting. There was a very interesting guest essay by two of my favorite Washington, D.C. analysts, John Rauch and Pete Wehner, that ran last week. The seeds of, in the New York Times, the seeds of democratic revival have already been sown. So maybe things aren't quite as bad for the Democrats. John and Pete are joining us, familiar faces and voices on Keen on America. John, let's start with you. Why should the Dems be a little more cheerful than at least the Journal is suggesting?
Well, the situation right now is bleak for them, and we don't claim otherwise. That's just clearly true. But when you have a patient in the hospital who's just very sick, it can be a situation where you know that there's really no path to turn them around. Or it can be a situation where, in fact, you can see a path toward recovery. Pete and I interviewed 19 prominent Democrats from multiple factions of the party, the left, the center. We plowed through a bunch of reports, published interviews to just learn as much as we can. And we surprised ourselves a little by finding that the Democrats have figured out that they have a major strategic opportunity, which is to become the party of prosperity, something they have not consistently been since 2 generations ago. Now, that's not to say that they'll get there. I mean, these are Democrats. If they can find a way to screw up, they probably will. But there's a strategic opening for them, and they see it.
Pete, this idea of the party of prosperity, your piece with John has a graph of when it comes to prosperity, Republicans have an edge, but that hasn't always been the case. And doesn't seem to be a great deal of difference between the two parties. I mean, but isn't prosperity rather like apple pie? I mean, everyone's in favor of it in theory. What exactly do you mean in this piece by prosperity, and what is the opportunity for the Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, I think prosperity means that people in their individual lives and the country writ large feels like things are getting better economically and otherwise. That prices are low and the conditions of the country on a day-to-day, day-to-day is good. People feel like services are being done. Government is relatively efficient. And we go into some of the details of what the Democratic Party can do in terms of reforms. I do want to add one thing to what John said, because I agree with his critique. And let me begin it by saying that one of the things that we asked the 19 Democrats that we reached out to was not to mention really Donald Trump, and that was a disciplining effort in a way, because
must have been for not just for them, but for you guys. You're the two of these most articulate and persistent critics.
Well, it certainly wasn't in my case, because I've given a lot more attention to him over the last 10 years than I ever would have imagined or ever would have hoped for. So it was a good disciplining exercise for them and for me. And the reason we did that is that the reflex for Democrats, ever since Trump is burst on the national scene, is to go after him, whether they go after him on corruption or whether they go after him that he's a threat to democracy. He lives in their headspace, as he does with many Americans. And Democrats have to have a frame of mind, cast of mind, that says, what do we stand for positively and affirmatively that has nothing to do with Trump? So that was what we were after. Having said that, and again, building on your initial question, what's the hope for Democrats? I think the hope for Democrats is in part Donald Trump. I think our presupposition is that Trump is inept in many respects when it comes to governing, and there are certain opportunities that are going to open up. And the question is whether Democrats take advantage of it. Trump's latest approval rating in Gallup is 37%, which is near his record low in his first term. Independents, it's at 29%. There was a really interesting AP NORC poll, which showed that an overwhelming number of Americans feel like the conditions in their lives are worse under Trump than they were before, and much worse than they expected. I think if you asked some of the sophisticated pollsters and said, Trump undoubtedly beat Kamala Harris for an array of reasons, but very high on the list was the sense that Trump would be efficient, and that he would be competent. And I think reality is starting to kick in that that's not the case. And as that continues to happen, that will give Democrats the opening that they need. And then the question is whether they can take advantage of it.
I want to come back to John in a second, but Pete, you began your career in politics in the Republican Party. So speaking to Democrats probably doesn't always come naturally to you. What was your sense of the vitality and the mood of the Democrats? You said you've spoken to a number of leading Democrats, Rahm Emanuel, for example, a number of others. What was your take as an old-time politico on their mood and their energy?
Yeah, I would say that they're coming out of a funk. I mean, there was a lot of despair, and feelings of depression, low energy. What's the purpose? I think it's difficult to overstate how difficult a blow it was to Democrats and to those of us who were critics of Trump that he won a second term. I think that was just a shock to the system. The first time you might be able to write it off as a fluke of a kind. In this case, it clearly wasn't that. So I think the energy level was very low. My sense is that they're beginning to shake that off, that they're recovering their balance, their energy. We do see polling to that effect. So that's number one. I think their temperament is better than it was. In terms of what else that I noticed that's of note from Democrats, I would say it's the degree to which there is openness to making changes on the cultural and economic front. They know they're really in a box, in a bind, and they have to change. Now, how they change, of course, depends. If you're on the progressive end, it may be one thing. If you're on the center right or center left, it's something else. But, in some respects, the path to healing begins with the acknowledgement that something has gone wrong. And I think increasingly and soon probably overwhelmingly, Democrats are going to acknowledge that we're doing something wrong. We have to reconnect with the public, and one of the areas that they have to do that for sure is on the cultural front.
Yeah, I think it almost goes without saying. John, your day job is at Brookings. You and I have had many conversations over the last few years about Donald Trump. You've always been, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, you've always been more pessimistic about him. I've always considered him somewhat normal in the paranoid style of American politics. And when I read this piece, I have to admit, whether or not I agree with your conclusions, I was encouraged by the fact that it reads like a Brookings paper. It reads on policy as if all the Democrats have to do is figure out how to rebuild America, how to invest, how to have new programs. In terms of this project, did it change your mind about the existential crisis in America? And please again correct me if I'm wrong. You seem to be more pessimistic. You view Trump and Trumpism as a much more existential threat to the American Republic, certainly than I do.
Yes, that's a fair comment, and you and I have had our shares of conversations about that. But I would agree with you, Andrew, that partly because of the way we set up our question, which is let's not talk about Trump. Let's talk about your party and the opportunities it faces. We didn't see the same fixation on Trump. But also, I think you are correct that it has become clearer to leading Democrats. And I would say it's also become clearer to me, thanks to what we learned in November of 2024, that opposing Donald Trump, anathematizing him, cursing him, wishing he'd get over with is not the answer. That Democrats need a positive agenda. They all understood that, every one of them. That it has to focus first and foremost on the economy, the American dream, prosperity, a brighter future. They all understood that to a person. Pete will affirm or deny that. And they also all understand, with maybe one or two exceptions, that if they don't get to the center on cultural issues, no one will hear what they have to say on economic issues. Now, I'm not sure that in October of 2024, I or the party would have had clarity about any of those things. So yes, I think this represents a change, and I think it represents progress. Pete, do you see it that way?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I'd say of the two domains, economic and cultural, I guess there was equal acknowledgement on both. I think what surprised me a little bit and encouraged me was the degree to which many Democrats acknowledge that they have really gotten on the wrong side of the cultural issues, and that is a huge hurdle. Rahm Emanuel told us, and we quote him in the essay, saying that if you don't get through that cultural barrier, that cultural hurdle, that people aren't going to listen to you. The kitchen table, so-called kitchen table issues, and others said the same thing. And you've already seen signs of it from Gavin Newsom and others. Gavin Newsom is a bellwether of a certain kind because he's progressive. He's obviously governor of California, and he's moved away on some of the issues related to transgenderism, school sports, the pronouns, and so forth. That's important because one of the ads, I think it's the ad that was run most frequently at the end of the campaign by the Trump folks, was the one on transgenderism where they said Kamala Harris is for they, them, and Donald Trump is for you. So they understand.
And that was a brilliant, I don't know who came up with that, but it's a brilliant ad because it's true.
Yeah, it is a brilliant ad. And of course, she had actions in 2019 that she endorsed certain policies that are recognized as so far out of the mainstream as to be insane. If you ask me to compare where the party is culturally in 2025 versus 2019, I'd say it's in a very, very different place. We've talked, John and I, to friends who work in the media. And in the last few years, and John can correct me or elaborate on this, but we've heard, and I've heard from different spheres, that the so-called wokeness craze that peaked around 2019, 2020, and I think it's been receding on its own since then. But given the outcome of the 2024 election, it's receding a lot faster, I'd say.
John, is in a sense history repeating itself? I remember when I first came to America in the 80s, there was, particularly amongst progressives, the idea that Reagan was insane, that he was going to destroy the world, that he was an actor, he had no idea what he was doing. And then, of course, ultimately, he was an enormously successful and popular president. And Clinton attempted to reinvent Reaganism, maybe on the left, certainly in the center. Are we seeing, in an odd way, the same thing with Trump? In 10 or 20 years, might Trump, I don't want to turn this again into a conversation about Trump, but is Trumpism, the populism of Trump, is it Reaganism 40 years later? And will we eventually see, and that's, your piece seems to be suggesting that, will we see a a new Clinton, a new figure able to take the popularity of Reaganism and present it in a more progressive light?
Well, we invoke Reagan in our essay, as we do Clinton, but we invoke him in the other direction. We think that the people now who have the opportunity to perform the same kind of maneuver that Reagan performed with such success in the late 70s, then in his campaign, and then on into his presidency, is available to the Democrats. And that's setting up their party as I said earlier, the party of prosperity. In the 1970s, Pete and I were there. We remember this, and you may as well. The economy got stuck in stagflation. The Carter administration couldn't handle it, and decades of Democratic credibility on the economy, from Roosevelt to JFK and even Lyndon Johnson, went down the tubes. And Reagan came along and picked up a supply side agenda which said, you know what, we don't have to live in a stunted economy with high prices and slow growth. We can unleash the supply side of the economy to make ourselves more productive. That turned out to be a political winner. It turned out to be an economic winner. Flash forward 2 generations, Donald Trump and the Republican Party are weirdly running on an agenda of scarcity, beggar thy neighbor, and do with less. You can't have $30. You'll have to make do with $2. We're short on housing, so fewer immigrants. Stuff is too expensive, so let's make it even more expensive by putting a tax on imports. They've abandoned a story about growth, prosperity, and what the Democrats now called abundance. And Democrats, here's the point of why I think they've got such an opportunity. Democrats have figured that out. Some call it an abundance agenda. The people we talk to don't use the term. There are other terms like prosperity, American dream, growth. We call it supply side because that's what it really is. But this is a realization that if the center of the party can emphasize reducing barriers to growth like zoning, if the left of the party can reduce barriers to growth like corporate manipulations and cartels that raise prices, cause scarcity, the Democrats can tell the story about being the ones who make the country prosperous again. And that's a huge opportunity.
Pete, we've talked endlessly, you and I, and many other shows about this so-called abundance agenda. The Klein-Thompson book is a massive bestseller, been enormously influential. But it's also very divisive on the left. Perhaps its angriest critics are actually coming from the left rather than the right. Isn't that a problem for the Democrats, that this idea of abundance, of making, and again, I take your point on Carter, but in many ways, what you're suggesting is a kind of Clintonian centrism. I can't remember the name of the committee or the organization that he was part of, but essentially making a market capitalism, an efficient market capitalism, a little fairer. I mean, that's basically what the abundance agenda is, and that's what you're suggesting. But there are many people in the Democratic Party who loathe that.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable statement. And Democrats, like virtually any party, if they're going to change, if they're going to reform themselves, it means that there's going to be an internal battle. I think it'd be silly for Democrats to pretend otherwise. And there's a strong progressive wing in the Democratic Party, and there's a more centrist wing. I'd say that the progressive wing has been more dominant, over the last 5 to 10 years. But I think that the more center left part of the party is being energized, and they're going to have that debate and argue what does it mean actually to push for prosperity. I mean, it was really John's insight, which we weaved into the piece, which is that there is some common ground, and he can elaborate on this potentially between the more progressives and more of the centrists in terms of the barriers to growth, and the left tends to focus, like Bernie Sanders and AOC and others, on corporate corruption, and that can certainly fit within, I think, the Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson, Pete and John agenda as well. One other thing, Andrew, that I just want to mention in this context, I do think, since you brought up Clinton, and we've talked about Reagan, that it's very helpful for people who want to reform a party to look back at the people who have done that successfully and try and see what are the through lines, what are the common denominators that you see. So again, we talked about Reagan. Clinton was with the Democratic Leadership Conference.
Yeah, that was the conference.
And he had an agenda, and he chose a couple of key issues. Primus inter pares was welfare reform, to change welfare as we know it. That was both a policy initiative, but also a signal to the country that the Democratic Party was changing, was embracing the concepts of personal responsibility, the value of work. And that was contentious in the Democratic Party in 91, 92. And Clinton was able to make that case. And then he had the famous sister soldier moment.
Yeah, I mean, he had the sister soldier moment, and your equivalent, or at least you suggest in the piece, is Wes Moore,
right,
America's only black governor who rejected a reparations bill. Is that the sister soldier moment, John? Should it be? I mean, is history really replaying itself in this sense?
Well, we don't have a candidate yet, so
yeah, but you might have one. I mean, certainly Moore will be encouraged to run. It's likely he will.
It's, I think, another of the many straws in the wind that Democrats understand that they've driven themselves into a box canyon on the culture. On your point a minute ago, Andrew, about the coming battle between the party's center and the party's left, my own view on that, having done this research, is that the big front for that fight's going to be on the culture, because there the Democrats don't really have a plan, and a lot of the party is still just not willing to accept what it considers, for example, to be throwing trans people and LGBT people under the bus. Where I think actually they have a potentially unifying agenda is this economic agenda of prosperity, because there's an anti-corporate version of that narrative that says do something about the monopolies and the rigged rules and the stock buybacks and all the rest of it. And there's a government reform aspect of that agenda, which is do something about the rigged zoning rules and the ridiculous licensure and permitting requirements. And you can do both. So that's where the potential is. But before they get there, the culture is, we got a lot of phrases from them, like, we've got to get to the mainstream, got to go to where people are, got to do better listening. Lots of kind of, can I say, shibboleths, Pete? But not.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the report sounds like something put together by McKinsey, which everybody. I'm not suggesting that you're McKinsey, but you're just telling us, or they're telling you what everybody already knows.
That on the culture, there's work to be done that they haven't done. And that's going to take, I think, the kind of confrontation that Pete is talking about.
I will say, Andrea, that being charged with our writing sounding like a McKinsey report may be the nastiest thing that you've said.
But I actually didn't. I said you're reporting on them as if they are.
We interviewed
they're respouting or recreating. They're the ones who have had the McKinsey report, and they're just feeding it back to you.
Nice try, Andrew, but we're deeply offended.
Yeah, I hope so.
This interview is
McKinsey's
over.
much better paid than we are.
Even at Brookings? Aren't you a branch of McKinsey, Brookings?
Yeah, no, we tried to edit out as much McKinsey as we could, but I'm willing to concede we're 100% successful.
I mean, one of the things I read in the piece, it was a quote from somebody called Jayapal, a Democrat, and I'm quoting her. We need to make the case that we don't suffer from scarcity as a country, we suffer from greed. We have to be willing to call out the villains, the giant corporations that have such concentrated power that they've driven out small businesses, raised prices on the things we need, and lowered wages for workers so they need 3 jobs instead of 1. That sounds to me like just standard, for better or worse, standard democratic ideology, sort of not necessarily anti-capitalist, but certainly very ambivalent, skeptical on American capitalism.
Well, I think the 2 key words that she used there, what got my attention, is artificial scarcity. I think that's the phrase. Was that the phrase before scarcity? Let's put that back up for a second. We don't suffer from scarcity, we suffer from greed. And that's what I would focus on. Think about, things like the giant hospital mergers, which have done so much to reduce competition and drive up prices. Think about the stock buybacks. If you're serious about making the economy more open, more responsive, more competitive, so that prices will come down and productivity will go up, there's a ton of things you can do on the left. And so that's the kind of thinking that I personally would welcome. It doesn't really sound to me like socialism.
You're both, I mean, Pete, you're a former Republican who's been very public about your leaving of the party. John, you're a defiant centrist. What did these conversations convince you about the Democratic Party? Is it convinced either of you to join it? Maybe the party needs guys like you, former Republicans or centrists, who are going to tell people what they don't want to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a de facto Democrat, at least certainly in my voting habits, since Trump has come onto the scene. I hope that we have something to contribute to Democrats. We're trying not to look at this through a political lens, in the sense that we're openly rooting for one party or the other. We're not pollsters and we're not strategists. We're writers. In the same way that we've written together, actually, and separately a number of times, what Republicans would have to do to get better. But sure, I hope that Democrats are open to the ideas that we have, and we're certainly able, along with a lot of other people, to try and learn. As I said, study history. The other point I want to make, Andrew, is this piece was specific and concrete in many ways, but it was also thematic, right? Which is, you've got to get a prosperity agenda or affordability agenda. You have to get right on the culture. But this was not like a 10-point plan of what Democrats have to do. Part of it is a cast of mind. And what I would say about that is, until the Democrats choose a nominee for president, there are intrinsic limits to what they can do, or what any party out of power can do. I think what the Democratic Party can do is to lay the foundation and do the groundwork that allows talented politicians to make arguments and to make a case. But at the end of the day, what's going to matter most to the Democrats is who their nominee is. And if you get somebody like a Bill Clinton or a Barack Obama, or Ronald Reagan, or Tony Blair in the case of the UK.
Yeah, I was thinking Blair. I mean, we touched on Moore, who some people think might be the Clinton of this election, or the Tony Blair. You also talked to Rahm Emanuel, who's certainly well equipped to be president, whether he has the personality. John, do you have any sense of what kind of personality will be required? I mean, whatever one thinks of Trump, he's a master politician, master image maker, a man from reality television who has applied all his skills he learned there, if that's the right word, to win in politics. Can a conventional politician like Wes Moore really succeed in the America of the 2020s? Might it require a Mark Cuban or somebody else we've never even heard of to actually take this message to the American people?
You know, it's funny you mentioned Mark Cuban. Just yesterday, I was playing a podcast. In fact, maybe it was one of yours in which his name came up. You know, if it's a mainstream Democrat, it's likely to be a governor, and it's likely to be someone like Wes Moore or Josh Shapiro or maybe Gretchen Whitmer, but someone who has shown that he or she can govern. I don't think it'll be a senator. But it seems to me that the two qualities that, well, maybe three qualities, if I can remember three at once, that voters are looking for. Number one, they want someone authentic who doesn't sound like a politician. Number two, they want someone energetic. That's what they don't see, for instance, in Biden and the Democratic Party. They see listlessness.
And they're right, of course.
And they're right, of course. And number three, they want change. They want a change agent who will challenge the status quo. And that's hard to get on the inside. So I am open to the idea that it might be, for example, Mark Cuban. Now he's given an almost Sherman-esque statement of lack of interest. I don't know that that disqualifies him, but I think Democrats should take the idea of an outsider seriously. I don't know, Pete, do you think that's crazy?
No, I don't. And I think it's the right way to look at it. The one thing I would add to it is you really don't know until you know. Let me give a couple of examples. When Barack Obama ran in 2004, of course he in 2008, he ran on hope and change. And I'm not sure that there were many people in the party that said, we need to come up with a candidate who's going to articulate hope and change. He was a person of supreme talent. But what has to happen is that these people have to play to their strengths. And often if the rest of us are thinking through, this person has to do this or say that or look like this, until you see somebody of great talent who kind of breaks the model and breaks the mold. So we don't know what's going to emerge. And of course, we don't know what the situation in the country is going to be in 2026 when this race is going to start after the midterms and obviously through 2027 and 2028. And the other thing I would say is, having worked on presidential campaigns and in politics for a long time, there's nothing like running for president. I think people who are governors and senators think they know what it's like. It's not. And so people who look good, when they're on Sunday talk shows and giving some stump speeches here and there, once you get into the presidential ring, it's just a lot different, a lot harder. And then you will see who has the talent and who doesn't. But it's not always easy to tell in advance. Reagan is another kind of good example of that. Democrats were dismissive of him. They thought he was a third-rate actor, an ideologue. But he had a personality and a set of ideas that resonated with the country. And Democrats didn't recognize it until he blew them away. He won 40 states in 1980, won 44 states in 1980, and then he won 49 states in 1984. So we're just going to have to wait. That's why you have these endless primary process to see who emerges.
Finally, for both of you, as I said, I was encouraged, not that I'm particularly pessimistic about America anyway, but I was encouraged by this piece. And I wasn't quite sure why, but talking to you both, you talk to Democratic politicians rather than Americans. But the message of prosperity and hope and the American dream, we could be talking about 1995, 2015, 2025, 2035. The implicit message in this piece is that the American people haven't changed. There's been this idea amongst some people that Americans have somehow gone mad, which produced Trump and MAGA and all the hysteria around that. But you seem to be both suggesting that the American people, and that's, of course, a term that's hard to define, are basically not that different from the American people of the 70s, 80s, 90s, or the last 50 years. Is that fair?
It's our hope. Now, I've been so wrong about so many things, assuming that the future would look like the past. I would never have expected a candidate like Trump, or for that matter, Bernie Sanders, who almost took the nomination in 2016 to get where they've gone. And although for 50 years the Party of Prosperity's had a big advantage in national elections, maybe that's not true anymore. Maybe the culture trumps it. Excuse the inadvertent pun. But yes, Andrew, I one of the lessons that I think came out of the 2024 election was that it was an election with two extremely strange candidacies. Trump because he's strange, and Harris because she had a 100-day campaign. But the decision that the voters made was pretty conventional. They embraced peace and prosperity. They wanted to see lower prices. They wanted to see law and order. And that looked more like the Republicans than the Democrats. And it just did, frankly. So in that sense, yeah, I think maybe you're right. I think maybe we're hoping for a reassertion of normalcy, and we think we see a normal path for Democrats ahead. It's still, I don't know though, Pete, what do you think? It's all so hazy.
Yeah, I mean, another way of reading your title is not so much the seeds of democratic revival have already been sown, it might be the seeds of American revival, Pete.
Well, it might be, and I'm all in favor of revival, and
as long as it's not an evangelical revival, of course.
Exactly. We don't want that. Me above all. But yeah, look, human history is filled with revivals, steps forward and steps.
Especially America, especially American history. It's defined by revivals.
It absolutely is, and our hope is that'll happen. I put a slight caveat on what you said, Andrew. I mean, I do think that if you look, why did the voters vote for Trump rather than Harris? What John said is right. These are pretty traditional issues. The economy was overwhelmingly the most important issues, but there were others as well. I still can't shake the sense that the fact that nearly a majority of Americans voted for a man of such borderless depravity and lawlessness and cruelty, got the votes that he did. I think it is a kind of CAT scan, honestly, on the American soul, and it doesn't mean that it's permanent. I do think it means it's serious. And if you had told me, and I'm guessing if any of us 20 years ago had been sitting around at a bar and said, here's a candidate that has done the following 10 or 15 things, or said the following 10 or 15 things, you think that person would be able to get 7 votes in America? I said, nah, maybe 14. The idea that he would get 77 million is, to me, still inexplicable, and it says something dark about America. I'm not dispositionally that way. I certainly grew up as a person loving the country, but I also think that that's reality. I think we have to acknowledge it, and again, I think we have to also be aware that that's not necessarily a permanent state. I have a friend who once said, you can be a theoretical pessimist, but you ought to be an operational optimist. And I think that's how people have to live their lives, which is to be operational optimists. And I think with this essay, we were trying to be operational optimists.
And
Right.
go on. Just a codicil to what Pete just said. One thing that I think really is different about the American polity than in the Reagan era when Pete and I came of age is the complete collapse of confidence in our institutions, and an almost nihilistic, especially among younger people, an almost nihilistic attitude that none of them work. I talk to college classes, and I've taken to asking them, what institutions do you really have confidence in? And I ask them to shout them out, and they typically can't come up with anything. And then so I'll say, what about the university you attend? Well, no, not really. When I did this recently at a college class, the only institution that they could come up with, that they could agree that they really had confidence in, was the local fire department, not even the local police department. And that's a that's psychologically and politically a toxic and dangerous place to be. And that's driving a lot of other forces. And that, I think, it may not be brand new, but it's in a worse state now, I think, than I've ever seen it.
Well, I had a perfect Hollywood ending of cheerfulness, but two of you have ruined that. So
it's our job.
I know. I'm going to let you get back to your Brookings, not your Brookings, your McKinsey colleagues, your well-paid McKinsey colleagues. You can go back to your report, and the three of us will talk again in the not too distant future, because it's always wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much for the generosity of your time, and anyone who hasn't already read it needs to read Pete and John's piece in the Times. The seeds of democratic revival have already been sown. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.